Welcome to the Book Faire podcast. My name is Anthony, and this week we have an interview with Kyle Casey Chu, aka Panda Dulce. A Minnesota school district backs down from a book banning policy. Brooklyn Public Library's program Books Unbanned is taking applications for funding for libraries nationwide to launch Freedom to Read programs. And an Illinois bill will give funding for state libraries to increase security in response to violent threats. Now, let's start with an interview with Kyle Casey Chu, aka Panda Dulce, one of the founding members of Drag Story Hour and author of the new middle grade novel, The Queen Bees of Tybee County. Hello, Kyle. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Anthony?
I'm great. Can you start off by introducing yourself to the audience as well as the book we'll be talking about today?
Yes. So, hello. My name is Kyle Chu, aka Panda Dulce, the drag queen. I am a writer, a filmmaker, and one of the founders of Drag Story Hour. And my debut middle grade novel, The Queen Bees of Tybee County, follows Derek Chan, who is a Chinese American basketball star in the seventh grade, who's shipped off to his grandma's house in rural Georgia, where he discovers and explores his queer identity, his love of drag, and participates in a local pageant.
And you said you are a filmmaker and that this is your debut novel. Do you have any insights or anything that you noticed while writing a novel for the first time?
I think what I realized is I came into this process as a serial outliner. So I think in the writing world, there's often conversation of two different camps of writer. One is someone who takes a structured approach, outlines, and then writes it, and then somebody who's a pantser or flies by the seat of their pants. And I came in as a structured outliner, and when I wrote the first draft, I realized that it doesn't always faithfully reflect on the page in the way that you planned it. And so I think through this editing process, I learned to allow room for spontaneity, for exploration, for as you get into the flow of things, letting your characters speak for themselves and really let you know who they are and what choices they might make.
One of the things that I talk about with authors a lot because I think it's very interesting is the business side and a little bit of the editing process. As someone who was very structured in their approach, how did you respond to receiving notes from editors?
That's a great question. I am blessed to have a really great editor, Jen Ung, who in her edit letters would point to overarching things that might be used to strengthen the story, certain devices that could be used, tightening, lengthening, all of that. And she has an approach of, this is all a starting point of conversation. You can take what you need and leave what you don't, and we can discuss anything further. And I think this openness and this flexibility really helped me find the heart of the story and led me to asking the right questions and having the right conversations that got us to the arc that we wanted.
So what are the right questions? What was that process for kind of deconstructing who Derek is and finding that character in the writing process?
Totally. I think for Derek, because at this age of development, sixth to seventh grade, conformity and social cohesion is such a high survival need that he felt he needed to kind of glom onto this identity as a basketball player as a sense of who he was in the social map of his world. And what this book asks is that enough for you? Is that everything you are? Is that comprehensive? And I think the answer is that he contains multitudes, and one of them is in the form of a drag queen. And so this book gives exploration and permission to explore uncharted territory and also gives him the permission to be both and as opposed to either or.
And you mentioned becoming a drag queen. You yourself are a drag queen, and you are also one of the founding members of the Drag Queen Story Hour. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like, as well as how that lends to this story, specifically with Derek?
Totally. So I'm one of the founding queens of Drag Story Hour, and Drag Story Hour is exactly what it sounds like. It's drag queens and drag performers reading stories to kids in libraries, bookstores, and schools. And one of the ways I got involved is because I have a background in K through 5 education and social work, and I've worked with queer youth. And in San Francisco, I was trying to find a way to sustain my youth work And as a teacher, often queer and trans teachers struggle with this quandary of whether or not to disclose their identities in the classroom, whether or not it's appropriate or relevant, or if you absolutely should, but it's always a point of reflection. And what Drag Story Hour did was it encouraged me to bring my full self. It said, why wouldn't you bring that? And that's something that really spoke to me and resonated with me. And so I think, especially today, the far right spun the wheel and it landed on reviling drag queens and trans people as today's boogeyman, where, of course, history and fact will show that this is not the case. And they're obviously, like, often the fiercest proponents and advocates of treating people fairly and with the respect that everyone deserves and dignity everyone deserves. And so, in writing this book, I wanted to introduce the way that drag has profoundly changed my life and how it kind of allowed a world of possibility for me to have fun and be silly and feel powerful in the feminine aspects of myself instead of suppressing those things that might feel like a blemish at a certain time, but really can be such a source of pride.
And you mentioned that there were attacks from the right, and it's kind of an ongoing thing still. It's a very unfortunate and ugly part of what's going on in the country today. Are those aspects something that you put into the Queen Bees of Tybee County, or did you look at more of an idealized version of a young queer person going through their journey?
That's a great question. I think the story balances both. Um, the goal of this book for me was to introduce a world that we can work towards and that we can imagine and hope for that exists. And so there definitely is a presence of opposition and of xenophobia present in this book and discussion of that. And there are also other elements of support and alike resistance rising to meet that force alongside Derek. And I think it's important to be optimistic and also realistic. And that is exactly what the approach that this narrative takes.
And you mentioned xenophobia, and that kind of segues perfectly into one specific line that I highlighted that I wanted to ask you about was when he meets his grandmother Claudia in the book. She talks about the beauty pageants that are happening. He says that, and this is paraphrasing, when he pictures someone organizing a beauty pageant in Georgia, he thinks of a white woman and not his Chinese American grandmother. And that kind of brings into the intersectionality in this book. Is that something? Um, is that statement something you'd like to unpack a little bit here?
Of course, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. And shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw. Um, yes, so I feel as a queer and trans Asian American person that at no point am I ever one or the other. It reminds me of past elections when they said, would you vote for someone who is black or someone who is a woman as a black woman? And these are just impossible to untangle or to separate, and someone shouldn't be asked to. And so for Derek, he, much like me, is exploring coming into a sense of self as a Chinese American person and as a queer person in the seventh grade. And these are two really big topics that are immense for anyone to unpack, let alone a 12-year-old. And so, what I wanted to do is highlight how the world treats difference in general, how societal expectations can pressure oneself to assimilate, and how even someone that Derek looks up to and who helps nurture his creative voice isn't a stranger to this sort of discrimination. And I think what's germane to that is this idea that we might feel so isolated in our pain or that it is a unique experience that no one else has ever tread before. But these are things that people have long felt and long experienced, and you need only open a book or watch a movie to realize this is true.
And let's talk a little bit about Claudia. Who is she, and how do we learn more about her throughout the book?
Sure. So Claudia is Derek's uh, second generation Chinese American grandmother who came to the US through her father, who was in the military, which is a very unique situation considering the US's history of immigration and selectively letting people in based on their race. And Claudia is a firecracker of a person who volunteers for the local pageant. She is a force to be reckoned with. And as she settled in Heritage, Georgia, which is a fictionalized town represented in the book, she finds that a lot of the pageant girls would come to Chan's Fabrics, where the alteration shop that her family owned, to get their dresses made, but wouldn't look her in the eye. And she realized that she wanted more than anything to be seen in a certain way, and she wanted to be dignified and dimensionalized as a human being and as a peer. And so she participated in the local pageant that Derek considers participating in this book, and she came out guns blazing with a Chinese fan dance and really shows the world who she is with a boldness and ferocity that only she can bring.
So Claudia came up facing this discrimination, and we see her in her current state as the established, almost a matriarch of this community, designing dresses for pageant contestants. And when Derek meets her, he doesn't know a whole lot about her. What is his reaction to her? Uh, Even though he's spent time over there, he doesn't seem to remember it. What is his reaction to meeting her seemingly for the first time in this book?
So I think, like me, Derek had, or maybe I should say, because Derek has an estranged relationship with his grandma for unknown reasons that are perhaps unpacked in the book. Um, I think all he has to glom onto in terms of who she is the representations that he's seen in the media that he's consumed, which is minimal to say the least. And so a lot was left to imagination for him. And when he finds out that there are all of these dimensions to Claudia that he had never even heard of, uh, I think he's at first surprised. And as he settles into heritage with her, realizes that this is the grandma that he's always known and loved. And just like her, he has all of these onion layers that deserve unpacking as well.
And how about Derek's relationship with his dad? At the beginning of the book, we see that he has a bit of pressure put on him from his dad to perform in high school. Is that pressure something that Derek continues to consider as he's exploring these beauty pageants and being a drag queen?
Absolutely. I would say that it even gets to the heart of the big dramatic question of the book. It's something that I think a lot of Chinese Americans experience growing up, which is a familial pressure to succeed that I once resented as a kid because it meant often overachieving and being overprogrammed, and striving for perfection and, sometimes invalidating feelings of never being enough. And I think with growing up and introspection and further reflection as an adult, I realize it comes from a place of pride and of love. And it comes from protection as well, and wanting somebody to be untouchable and wanting your kid to just be good wherever they are and be taken care of. And so I feel like this is absolutely a pressure that Derek feels and internalizes. And in the book, it's rewarded with context as to why it exists, especially coming from his father.
And when he moves in with his grandmother for the summer, he meets a young girl by the name of Ro, who is a contestant for the beauty pageant. Who is Ro, and how does that kind of break apart Derek's expectations for what pageant contestants are like?
Sure. So much like Claudia broke the mold for Derek of what he considered to be someone who participates in pageants, Ro is kind of an analog, not like other girls, and participates in roller derby and is rough and tumble and loves makeup and is femme, but also has some tomboy or qualities to her. And I think what basically she teaches him is that, one, pageants are about showing who you are to the world and your truth. But another is that you you can't you can't preconceive who somebody is going to be, and don't judge a book by its cover, all of those golden rules, that you can find your people in even the most unexpected places. And there are people who can exist across the gender spectrum who might, read a certain way and be something completely different. And I think that's something that I definitely walked away from in middle school with the friends that I surrounded myself with.
Roe is breaking the mold. Derek is exploring himself through this idea of being in beauty pageants and being a drag queen. Um, and so Roe is kind of showing how even though someone can be a girl, can express tomboyish qualities, it doesn't exactly mean that there are set rules for genders, and kind of how they present and how they operate. Um, and you also use the phrase "find your people." Derek had a pretty solid idea of who he was and who his people were, even though he did have even though he did have his secrets. Can you talk a little bit about how coming to this rural town helped him explore those inner feelings and discover who his people were?
Totally. So, similar to my experience in middle school, a little bit about me. So, in middle school, I came out in the seventh grade very early on, and I feel like that kind of threw into disarray how I felt I fit into the social map of things, how I fit into the world, my sense of self. I lost all my friends. I felt I had to reinvent myself and refine myself in new people, which happened to be artists, and they've been my people ever since. But one of my things was playing with saxophone, and I thought that was who I was, and that was the value I brought. I was a great saxophone player. This is what I would be, 100%. And for Derek, this was basketball. And so he felt this was what he brought to the world, and he was so fixated on this that he is not giving an opportunity to the rest of the world and to other friend groups to be something else, or the potential or the possibility of being something else. And even when he first meets Rowan Giles, he's at first uncomfortable because he's never interacted with people before who don't pedestalize basketball and video games. And I think just giving them a chance and hanging out with them at the swimming hole kind of opens up a whole new world for him. And he realizes a new way of being. And it's just in that temporary mold break that he can see himself in another world. And so it's just like tiptoeing and breadcrumbing that familiarity, and that really helps people explore and gives them permission to do so.
This is kind of an off-topic question, expounding on something you mentioned existing across the gender spectrum, and just kind of what is your interpretation of the gender identity and how it pertain your what is sorry let me I'm trying to phrase this very particularly. What is your interpretation on gender expression, gender identity, and what it means to be a drag queen, and where that sits in kind of this uh, gender binary that we find ourselves in, that we're learning more about in the 21st century?
Sure. I want to be thoughtful about this question, but one of my good writing partners once made a great analogy for this, which is that you imagine you have a drawer full of buttons. And so they're different colors, different shapes, different textures. There's square ones, triangle ones. There were some with three holes, some with four holes, whatever. And the world that we've created tells us that only two can exist. It says there are only round buttons with this, with this color, or square buttons with this. And so you sort what you can into those piles, but what you'll find is that there's a world of other buttons there that don't fit into any of them. And I think this is a metaphor for the social construction of gender. And what the far right is misconstruing as biological sex is just a social construction of what we have deemed legitimate, when in reality, biological diversity exists. There's a non-trivial amount of assigned female people who can grow mustaches, or assigned male people who actually have large breasts and, you know, secondary sex characteristics that one might attribute with a different gender. And so I think what drag does is, one, it shows us that the gender that we are assigned or that people project onto us is performative mostly, and that even if I'm assigned male, I can, in a couple of hours with some CVS makeup, um, appear totally different and serve you a different reality. And I think drag is a great point of play and exploration, a jumping off point. And it's also reminds you not to take all of this so seriously, because one night you can be, the fly that landed on Mike Pence's head in a presidential debate. Another night you can be a trash can but make it glamorous. And another night you could impersonate Mariah Carey at, the VMAs. It's just, I think we take these things too seriously. It's not fixed, and we can all just relax a little bit about it.
And one more kind of open-ended question. I like to close this out with the same question I give to all guests on the podcast. So feel free to just use this as a chance to say anything you'd like related to this topic. Kyle, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
I see the stories that I create as just portals into other worlds. And it doesn't necessarily have to constitute a whole world, but it's just a door to show you that something else is possible. I'd like to believe that every story that we consume and every character that we meet is a possibility model, and that, especially for kids, how crucial it is to see these paths illuminated and the people we can become materialize in page or on the screen. I think for me, it's what helped me imagine that I could make it through a dark time when I came out and lost everything. Seeing drag made me realize that I could be feminine and powerful at the same time. Seeing queer films made me realize that it was not impossible to find love and that I wasn't doomed for tragedy. Uh, these are life houses and these are safe havens in the journey we're all on. And I just see myself as one of the makers of these. And hopefully someone will find safety in it and find understanding and find the compassion they need. And if not that, at least develop a sense of empathy for others who might be in different shoes than them.
Thank you. That was an interview with Kyle Casey Chu, aka Panda Dulce. Her new book, The Queen Bees of Tybee County, is available now. You can learn more about Panda Dulce and her work at kylecaseychu.com. Next, we'll be looking at notable releases out this week, but first, if you appreciate the work being done with the Book Faire podcast, there are a few ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, favorite, subscribe, or follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to help push it out to new listeners. Second, you can follow the podcast on Blue Sky at Book Faire Pod. You can also go to patreon.com/thebookfair to find episodes posted early as well as links to news sources used throughout the show. Lastly, the best way to support the Book Faire podcast is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Now, on with the show. Next, we'll be looking at notable new releases, starting with The Grove by Brooks Whitney Phillips. In early 1960s Florida, 15-year-old Penelope Pip Bean lives on her family's orange grove, juicy acres, with her resentful mother, angry father, and beloved 17-year-old sister, Sissy, Pip's only friend. As the siblings manage their chores and navigate their parents' constant bickering about the grove's precarious finances, they long for escape and look forward to visiting the annual traveling carnival, which recently arrived in their small town. But something is different about this year's visit. Upon the attraction's departure, Sissy withdraws emotionally, taking with her Pip's only solace. Feeling unmoored, Pip turns to writing stories and soon finds kind Juicy Acres farmhand Silas, with whom she grows close as they explore the orchard and its surrounding landscape. When Pip learns about what happened to Sissy, the truth and the aftermath of its reveal will test their loyalty like never before. Pip's devotion to her sister influences everything she does, and even when they're at odds, their heartfelt dynamic resonates throughout the novel. Luminous prose relays the protagonist's satisfying emotional growth over the course of this tale of love and loyalty. This book is recommended for ages 14 and up. Next up, a graphic novel, The League of Littles, by Casey Lyall, and illustrated by Sara Faber. Lyall teams up with illustrator Faber in this shenanigans-filled graphic novel, a dual comics debut that reimagines quintessential sibling rivalry. 9-year-olds Lexi, Mo, and Eli are trainees in the League of Littles, a covert resistance group that aims to uplift younger siblings globally. Their first mission is to find a missing pet before their longtime rivals, the Band of Bigs. As the Littles navigate their clandestine operation, they realize that outsmarting the Bigs will take teamwork, quick thinking, and lots of luck. Lyall skillfully transforms typical sibling dynamics into a thrilling spy adventure, complete with secret missions, opposing organizations, and high-stakes rescues. Keen world-building, along with the League of Littles and the Band of Bigs, is the Middles and Onlys Guild, adding nuance to this playful spin on perceived familial hierarchies. Faber's energetic artwork complements the book's blend of comedy and daring do, which emphasizes teamwork, problem-solving, and learning to recognize individual strengths, making for an amusing romp that's chock full of heart and laughs. Back matter includes character profiles rendered as top-secret agent dossiers. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. Next up, If We Survive This, by Racquel Mary. Colombian and Irish-American 18-year-old Flora was supposed to be attending college in Los Angeles and trying her best not to acknowledge the intrusive thoughts brought about by her undiagnosed obsessive-compulsive disorder. Instead, she spent the last 6 months surviving a zombie apocalypse caused by a global rabies mutation outbreak. With her mother dead and her father missing, she's become the sole caretaker for her 19-year-old brother Kane, who's recovering from a broken leg. Then Kane hears their father's voice calling to them through an old radio, claiming he's made it to the family cabin, which prompts the siblings to head for Northern California to join him. Along the way, they encounter 2 other survivors, including Mexican-American Crisanta, Kane's ex-girlfriend and Flora's longtime crush. As the group venture to the cabin together, it becomes clear that rabbits aren't the only thing they have to fear. Author Mary delves into the genre with resounding success. Alternating chapters titled Now and Then juxtapose Flora's life in survival mode with society pre-apocalypse. Introspective portrayals of OCD and steadfast siblinghood combine with standout depictions of classic horror tropes, bursting with sci-fi zombie gore in this tightly paced novel. This book is recommended for ages 14 and up. And lastly, The Tournament, by Rebecca Barrow. The pressure cooker of external expectation meets a roaring furnace of personal ambition in this Shakespearean tale by Barrow. Located on the coast of Washington, Gardner Mansion School for Girls has a unique educational philosophy that melds high academic standards and athletic pursuits with survivalist skills, including hunting and wound care. 17-year-old scholarship student Max, who grapples with internalized shame about her family's less affluent lifestyle relative to her peers, endeavors to win the Tierney Cup, an annual survivalist competition. Her plans are derailed when she learns that her former best friend Nora and transfer student Teddy will be participating as well. Nora, whose romantic advances Max spurned, finds in Teddy a partner who encourages her to step out of Max's shadow. Max wrestles with jealousy over Nora and Teddy's relationship, and Teddy struggles to manage her own violent urges. As the trio juggle the competition alongside mundane stress about academics and family, they must reckon with the sacrifices they'll make to achieve their goals. Via 3 close third-person perspectives that center nuanced discussions about class differences and belonging, Barrow weaves a stunning tapestry of complex character flaws and motivation, while creeping toward a haunting climax. This is dark academia at its finest. This book is recommended for ages 14 and up. And now, finishing this week's episode with some headlines, starting with Brooklyn Public Library's Books Unbanned program. Beginning in 2022 as a response to a rise in book challenges nationwide by groups like Moms for Library, Books Unbanned offers teens unrestricted access to the Brooklyn Public Library's entire digital collection, as well as building a network of advocates that champion the freedom to read. Books Unbanned wants to help other libraries build their own local teen freedom to read advocates with funding to support the effort. Libraries across the United States are invited to apply for one-time funds to launch programming for teens and young adults related to the freedom to read. A total of $50,000 of funding will be given out, ranging from $1,000 to $10,000 per recipient. Any U.S. library is eligible to apply, but special consideration will be given to small and rural libraries. The Books Unbanned team will also be available to help develop and implement ideas to empower young people as leaders, not only in supporting the freedom to read, but also library advocacy and their communities more broadly. Program funding is available to any library serving young people between ages 13 and 21, either public, grade school, or university level. You can find more information about eligibility and requirements at booksunbanned.com/funding. Again, Books Unbanned is offering priority to rural and smaller libraries with less public funding. Applications are open until July 11th at 11:59 p.m. Recipients will be announced by August 18th. Next, Illinois state legislators pass a bill to provide additional security resources to libraries. Along with the rise in censorship, radical groups like Moms for Liberty also led to an increase in violent threats against libraries and schools. In Illinois, this increase has urged lawmakers to pass Senate Bill 1550 specifically to increase funding for security to public libraries. This bill will allow the Secretary of State's office to issue security grants to ensure a safe environment for patrons, employees, and the community. Jason Shirley, library director for Bryan Public Library, stated, quote, "Smaller libraries that do not have the budget because of property taxes but do have a population that is much greater than ours will really benefit from a grant to get security cameras and silent alarms." End quote. While the bill passed the House unanimously, one lone no vote in the Senate was given by Senator Chesney Andrew. Other critics of the bill claimed that their support was contingent on what they are going to spend the money on. However, the bill did pass and is now ready to be signed into law by Governor J.B. Pritzker. Last story for the week, St. Francis School District is reversing their book banning policy and returning titles to shelves. In December of last year, the school board of St. Francis area schools in Minnesota voted 4-3 to adopt BookLooks, a site founded by people affiliated with Moms for Liberty, as part of their book removal policy. This policy removed manual review, and if a book was challenged that had a score determined by BookLooks to have inappropriate content, the book was automatically removed from libraries. Since adoption, more than 30 titles have been pulled from libraries and classroom shelves. Unsurprisingly, this change in policy was met with a lawsuit, Education Minnesota St. Francis and the American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota filed lawsuits. Last week, the school board accepted a settlement and agreed to reverse the new policy and adopt a new process for reviewing challenged materials. This new policy will include input from teachers, librarians, and student representatives. The committee will only be able to remove a book with a supermajority vote, and the school board can only overrule the review committee after publishing a report and acting in a public meeting. President of Education Minnesota St. Francis Ryan Fierick said, quote, "We achieved this settlement because parents, students, our community, and even Minnesota authors stood with educators to defend the freedom to read in public schools. The students' stories and commitment to fixing this terrible policy was particularly inspiring." End quote. Thank you to the people of St. Francis, Minnesota, for standing with the freedom to read. It's a relief that a policy like this was challenged so quickly after adoption, and that the voice of the community was able to affect change in their schools. This concludes another episode of the Book Faire podcast. If you'd like to learn more about any stories mentioned in this episode, sources are always available at patreon.com/thebookfair. There are no posts locked behind a paywall, and no subscription is required to access sources. You can also follow the show on Blue Sky at Book Faire Pod. And if you wish to help the podcast grow, the best way to do it is to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.